For those who are perhaps unaware, there are several wars going on in the world right now. These wars are contentious, barbaric, and bloody, no matter how you mark them. On top of that, there's potential for several, even bloodier wars that could be starting imminently. It's not unthinkable that young men my age will soon be dying in foreign wars in mass number. It's kind of sad and blackpilling to see how people can get so hysterical and bloodthirsty. These are the kind of people who acted and performed as decent, humane people only a couple years ago. But when the blood starts spilling, they turn into sharks. As my mom liked to say, when a horse is bucking you, the only thing you can possibly do is stay calm until the horse does. It's the same way with war. Emotions lose war. With all this in mind, let's try to get some perspective from history, and I thought I'd make a video on the 20 bloodiest events in history. My source for this video is the book Atrocities by Matthew White. The author compiled death tolls for and ranked the 100 bloodiest events in history, whether wars, genocides, purges, and more. He's very much a centrist, and his numbers are widely considered by people across the political spectrum as being the fairest. He also has the reputation for being the guy who's done the most research and work on this topic, where he's accumulated respected numbers for each atrocity from the most important experts in each field on each war, and then averages them for his results. My rule for this sort of thing is that if the only people who disagree with you are ideologues on a topic where they have a particular self-interest in disagreeing with you, you're doing good academic work. When the only people who tell you that your numbers are wrong are Nazis saying your death tolls on the Holocaust are too high, or communists saying that you're overestimating the Holodomor, you're doing something right. If someone thinks your estimate for the War of Spanish Succession is wrong, I respect them a lot more. Also, this book is just in general one of the best intros to world history out there. For people who want to know the broad scope of world history, this, alongside Tamim Ansari's The Invention of Yesterday, in my opinion, does the best job. This is because blood is blood, with no political bias or narrative structure. Through reading this book, you realize how Eurocentric and modern-centric most of the history that we get fed is. You realize really a lot of history went down in medieval China, or some country in Africa had some horrifying war when you were alive that you've never heard of. Matthew White's also just a really good writer who covers these terrifying topics with a lot of great humor, and his writing style is really accessible. Reading his blog was actually a big inspiration for Whatifalthist, and I tried to model my writing style on his. If Matthew White or any of his fans watch this channel, I'd love to have him on my podcast. Well, let's get started. The blood's not going to spill itself. Number 20, the Chinese Civil War at 7 million deaths. We're going to start with one that I know you all know about. For future reference, a lot of these will be set in China. The Chinese Civil War was cleaning up the warlord period at the end of the fall of the Qing dynasty that ruled China for 300 years. As the centralized power fell apart, China split into warlords, or local commanders who established control over certain regions. The idealistic Sun Yat-sen is widely considered the father of modern China. But he died off pretty quickly, and one of his officers, Chiang Kai-shek, rose to power. Chiang, starting in southern Guangdong province, launched a series of conquests up to Nanjing, which he made his capital, then followed by fighting warlords for a decade trying to unify China. Chiang Kai-shek ran the nationalist Kuomintang party that had support from both the Soviets and Americans. Chiang has, in my opinion, not been remembered fairly by history, with him being seen as both a competent leader and pretty decent man for the horrifying circumstances he was in. The communists were part of the Kuomintang coalition before Chiang turned on them. Mao Zedong rose to leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Chiang put as much effort as he could into killing Mao, who he saw as the great enemy. He trapped Mao's force in a tiny valley in southwestern China. However, at this point, the Japanese invaded China. The communists miraculously captured Chiang and made him promise to let the communists go. Chiang sadly did this and focused on beating the Japanese, who then went out conquering the eastern third of China during World War II. Mao then pulled off an epic military operation where he marched his tiny band over 1,000 miles, taking them from southwestern to northwestern China, which they then made into their new base of operations. The communists let the nationalists take the brunt of the fight against the Japanese while they grew stronger. When the Japanese were beaten by the Americans dropping a nuke on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Russians invaded Manchuria, an area the size of Texas in northeastern China, and then gave it to the communists. The Communist Party of China then used this as a base to attack the nationalists. The two fought a giant battle outside Beijing, which the communists won before the nationalists fled to Taiwan, and China became ruled by the Communist Party. Number 19. The Fall of Rome, killing 7 million people. This is my historical speciality, which I made a full video about. The Roman Empire fell into decadence and social rot, which then caused the 3rd century to be a period of horrifying barbarian invasions, plagues, and civil war, which killed off 1/3 of the Roman Empire's population. Balkan tribal commanders were able to pull the empire back together, converting it to Christianity, but also turning it into an incredibly unequal, socialist, basically slave state. It was very unstable, but also reliant on Germanic barbarians to man its entire military. A sort of balance emerged inside this weak society, and it was widely assumed by everyone that the Roman Empire would last forever. At this point, the Huns, a tribe originally from around Mongolia, smashed off the Eurasian steppe into Central Europe. The region at the time was inhabited by Germanic barbarians, which created a cascading effect of one tribe pushing forward into another. The Goth tribes tried to enter the Roman Balkans only to be herded into concentration camps and starved. The Goths then destroyed a Roman field army at the Battle of Adrianople. This completely broke the myth that Rome was invincible. There were around 20 years of peace at this point as the Huns solidified control over Central Europe. The Huns pushed the Vandal, Swabi, and Alan Germanic peoples over the Rhine River into modern France. The Roman Empire was completely incapable of raising militaries, since their society was so broken on so many levels. These tribes then went about looting the empire, even taking Spain and North Africa. The Visigoths also looted Rome, which was the first time that had happened in close to 1,000 years. Under Attila, the Huns ravaged the Balkans and then launched an invasion of France that only barely was defeated by a coalition of brigands, Visigoths, and Romans at the Battle of Catalonian Plains. Attila the Hun died of a nosebleed before sacking Rome. The Roman Empire just kind of fell apart 20 years later since it lost any vigor. The thing that's kind of shocking to me is how low the death toll here is. I mean, it's strange that it's the same as the Chinese Civil War, given this is the breakdown of a giant empire and civilization that lasted for centuries. One thing to keep in mind is that the populations in the ancient world were much lower. The entire Western Empire's population was probably something like 25 million at this point, like Australia today. Alternately, the lives of average peasants actually improved after the fall of Rome due to the removal of what had become a parasitic government. Number 18. The fall of Mongol China at 7.5 million deaths. This combines the Mongols with Chinese dynastic collapses, two things you'll see again and again on this list. The Mongols ruled China for a little bit more than a century, but were widely hated. The Black Death killed half of China's population, and also hit the Mongols harder than the native population. This destabilized the order, and a homeless criminal named Yang Zhuangzhang helped lead a revolt in South China based around a messianic sect of Buddhism named the Red Turbans. The Red Turbans actually pioneered gunpowder warfare and gradually knocked the Mongols out of China. There was then a split between the rebels where another faction, led by someone claiming descent from the pre-Mongol Sung dynasty, where they fought a giant naval battle on the Yangtze River at Lake Poyang, which was the largest lake battle in history. Yang Zhuangzhang won, installed himself as emperor and founder of the Ming dynasty, while installing an authoritarian state. Number 17, the 30 Years' War, also at 7.5 million. This war is so ludicrously complicated. This is going to be a simplification to the point of absurdity. Europe at the time was going through a secular cycle and was split in heated religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. The Spanish/Austrian Habsburg Empire had colonies on nearly every continent and was vying for dominance of Europe. Bohemia had a Protestant dynasty rise to power, which then would have turned the Holy Roman Empire, the giant ramshackle fake empire which supposedly dominated Germany, but was really split into like 500 states, Protestant due to electoral complications where Protestants rather than Catholics would get a majority of the electors voting for it. The Habsburgs then wiped out Bohemia, only to have Denmark declare war on them. The Habsburgs then crushed Denmark, only to have France, which was Catholic, but still the Habsburgs' great rival, pay Sweden to invade Germany to stop them. Sweden happened to be led by a military genius, Gustavus Adolphus, who won a series of incredible victories against the Catholics, which drove his armies across Germany all the way to Austria. He died at the Battle of Lutzen, though, and his army just kind of ran out of guys. Remember, guys, this is all occurring over a 30-year period. France then declared war on the Habsburgs, and the Spanish almost nearly conquered Paris before the French turned them back at the Battle of La Croix. By the way, this whole time the Dutch have been fighting the Spanish. The war then devolves into a standstill as people negotiate peace. The 30 Years' War was so horrifying, with armies raping, burning, and murdering, which, in some parts of Germany, including the part my ancestors came from, losing 80% of their population, that it made religious war taboo in the West, which then allowed the Enlightenment. It also created the German obsession with security and military spirit, which eventually resulted in the World Wars, alongside killing off Spain as a global empire. Number 16, the Russian Civil War at 9 million deaths. Russia was fighting World War I and losing massively to the Germans. Russia was also facing a secular cycle, and the Tsarist monarchy had been struggling with legitimacy for decades before the war. Russia's economy, which was in early industrialization, couldn't keep up with the pressures of total war as the entire supply chain broke down, leaving soldiers without pay or supplies, and cities starving. Moderate socialists seized power in the October Revolution against the Tsar. However, they couldn't fix the underlying issues, so the radical Bolsheviks launched the February Revolution, which seized control of Russia's major cities. Russia then spiraled into warlords. The Germans conquered modern Belarus, the Baltics, and Ukraine. The Bolsheviks, or Reds, controlled Russia's industrial heartland, and non-communists, or Whites, controlled all the edges of the country. The Germans lost the rest of World War I, and so had to give up their Eastern European colonies. Due to their central location, greater discipline, fanaticism, and toughness, the Reds were able to gradually crush the Whites. The Reds then launched an invasion of Poland, thinking it would spark a revolution across Europe, only to be defeated. Russia then became a communist country. Number 15, Leopold's Congo at 10 million deaths. In the Congress of Berlin, where the Europeans arbitrarily divided up the continent of Africa, Belgium got a massive portion of Central Africa, the size of Western Europe. Since Belgium was so inoffensive, it didn't scare anyone to give it to them. Even more strangely, it was the personal estate of King Leopold of Belgium, who was German and not Belgian, and was not the responsibility of the Belgian government. Leopold was a horrible person and wanted to get rich quick from the rubber boom, which was caused by the invention of the bicycle. He then forced the entire population of the Congo to get draconian or impossible amounts of rubber. When the Congolese couldn't reach these impossible targets, he then had them killed to instill fear, or also cut off their hands or genitals. This resulted in the death of half of the Congo's population. The scramble for Africa was for the most part pretty bloodless by historic standards, except for this. It's shocking to see someone, especially from a supposedly civilized society, kill half of the population of a country in a 15-year period. European press started to gradually realize what was going on in the Congo, followed by the Belgian government taking over responsibility of the area from Leopold. The Belgian government then tried really hard to make things right, and for the 60 years afterwards until the end of colonialism, it was widely acknowledged that the Belgians were some of the most humane colonizers. However, the scars still remain, and there's a real argument that Leopold's trauma is one of the biggest reasons the Congo was one of the poorest and worst off countries in the world today. Number 14, Wang Mang, with 10 million deaths. I'm not sure if this is fair, but I kinda see Wang Mang, get your jokes out now gang, as a Chinese Caligula. They lived at roughly the same time and had crazy emperor syndrome. Due to complicated harem politics, which I don't understand, that killed off a bunch of imperial candidates, 13-year-old Wang Mang became regent for a 1-year-old emperor. He then appointed himself emperor. He was a Confucian radical who, rather than developing policies to deal with the serious social issues and a starving peasantry, tried to change terminology and ceremonies to create proper Confucian protocol to make sure that heaven was pleased. He also refused to pay his bureaucrats, who then turned to illegal activities and became disaffected. He also tried to divide up the landed estates of the aristocrats to replace them with socialist peasant land ownership. China was hit by a series of massive floods, which caused mass famine and large peasant uprisings. After a series of bloody wars, the rebels won, beat Wang Mang, and another branch of the Han Dynasty took the throne. This was a big turning point in Chinese history, given since the harem politics got so complicated, the government started using eunuchs to manage the government so they weren't swayed by loyalty to their children. 13. The An-Lushan Rebellion at 10 million deaths. Look, another China war. This video is basically just a history of China at this point. The Tang Dynasty was one of the largest empires in history, with colonies deep in Central Asia. They did this by recruiting nomadic warriors who knew how to fight the other nomads who were the main inhabitants of Inner Asia really well. One of these was a Sogdian sheep thief from modern Uzbekistan. He rose up through the ranks of the Chinese army until he was a general, leading an army on China's northeastern frontier against the Mongols. The emperor was worried he was getting too powerful, and there was a rumor that he was having an affair with the emperor's wife. The emperor asked him to come to court, where An knew he'd been murdered. An then launched a revolution, which was backed by other similar tribal commanders. They torched the capital and killed the emperor. The emperor in turn sent an assassin to kill An. An was so morbidly obese that they actually struggled to cut through the fat to kill him, but finally did. The war at this point descended into a stalemate as the sons of both leaders continued the war. An's rebellion was finally defeated. This actually worked out to be one of the biggest turning points in Chinese history, which isn't surprising given it's hard to kill 10 million people in the 8th century. China beforehand was a Buddhist society with a strong warrior noble elite, which also had a large colonial empire. Afterwards, Confucian bureaucrats took over China, turning the nation inwards for the rest of its history. Number 12. World War I at 15 million. I'm not sure how much I can say about this war that you folks won't already know. The 19th century was Europe's golden age, with the continent leading the world in everything, whether technology, military, culture, politically, socially, and more. Almost the whole world was some variety of a European colony. However, Europe was young and buzzing with so much energy that the Europeans blew each other up. World War I was destined to happen with a dozen incidents where it nearly occurred, but in our timeline it started with the death of the Archduke of Austro-Hungary at the hands of Serbian nationalists. This then spiraled through a series of complicated alliances to a war between Germany, Austria, and Turkey against Russia, Britain, and France, and later Italy and America. The military technology at the time was massively biased towards the defense, which put the Central Powers, which needed to wage an offensive war to win, in a really bad place. However, the Central Powers, or really the Germans, fought admirably and nearly won the war in a handful of times, while crushing Russia to the east. There were also some side campaigns in Africa and the Middle East. World War I was a meat grinder which crushed Europe's spirit. The upper classes and the educated died in the highest proportion. Europe started the conflict sincere, optimistic, resourceful, and hopeful. The horrors of the trenches, which border on hell, broke Europe's spirit as a continent, meaning the next century was a slide into nihilism. I'm actually surprised that World War I killed so few people, given I would say it's historically more important than World War II, which killed over 4 times as many people as World War I. The armies involved were pushed beyond endurance, and the remaining countries of Germany, France, and Britain in 1918 were on the verge of mutiny before the entry of the United States, which tilted the war in their favor. The Allies made the Central Powers sign a humiliating treaty, which set up for the next World War. Number 11. The colonization of the Americas, also at 15 million deaths. In 1492, Columbus landed in the Bahamas under the leadership of the King of Spain. He then went out enslaving and gradually exterminating the native population in the search for gold deposits that didn't exist. The Spanish government reined him in after the native population of the Caribbean was already bordering on extinct. This was then followed by a series of remarkable conquests by Spanish adventurers. The conquest of Peru and Mexico was done by a crew of a few hundred guys who allied with large armies of native enemies. They came in, took over the native rulers as hostages, and then used them to take control of the state. They were then able to wipe out the native armies which tried to take power back from the Spanish. They enslaved the native populations where the Spanish government became involved, calmed things down, and both Pizarro and Cortez died in poverty. The death toll for this is kinda difficult to measure. Europe and the Americas had pretty similar populations when Columbus arrived, at something like 70 million. However, 90% of the native population of the New World died of disease, which is something the Europeans couldn't control. Even if the Europeans came with the best intentions to hug the natives and give them candy, 90% of their population still would have died. Likewise, almost all of this death toll is concentrated in the Spanish conquest of Mexico and Peru, where the native populations were the highest. The colonization of the modern United States barely registers here, since the native population there was so light. Number 10, the Atlantic slave trade at 16 million deaths. The Europeans saw a lot of fertile land for cash crops like sugar, tobacco, coffee, or cotton in the New World. The native population was wiped out by disease, and the whites would die working in the heat and due to tropical diseases. Africa didn't have strong states to protect its inhabitants from slavery, and its people were already disease and heat resistant, while the continent had a pre-established slave trade that the Europeans could tap into. The introduction of European crops in Africa caused mass population growth, which caused overpopulation and thus wars. The Europeans attached themselves to these African wars and took slaves from African kingdoms. This caused a perverse incentive structure as Africans started wars and slaving missions to buy more guns to get more slaves. The slaves were shipped over to America in the most inhumane conditions possible. The vast majority were sent to Brazil and the Caribbean. Due to how sugar agriculture works, the incentive there was to get slaves, work them to death, and then use the profits to buy more slaves to work to death. The modern United States, again, barely registers in sheer number of slaves imported or enslaved deaths. However, the U.S. was the only area in the New World where slave populations were sustainable. So in 1800, the U.S. had the largest amount of black people of any country in the world, while it imported numerically very few slaves. The slave trade was ended by an alliance of Britain and America at the turn of the 19th century due to the rising evangelical and Enlightenment pressures against slavery. Britain then forced the rest of the world to end the slave trade as well. Number 9. Tamerlane at 17 million deaths. Tamerlane, or Timur-i-Leng, or Tamar the Lame, was an Uzbek boy who claimed descent from Genghis Khan. He rose through the ranks of the military to install himself as military dictator of Samarkand. The region at the time had a mix of Mongol, Turkic, and Persian ancestry, which created a potent warrior mix. Tamerlane then launched a series of massive wars. He burned the cities all around him and constructed pyramids of skulls of his enemies. He smashed across the Middle East, destroying the early Ottoman Empire and slowing down their conquest of Byzantium by 50 years. He put the Ottoman Sultan in a cage to humiliate him. He also invaded Russia and fought all the way to the gates of Moscow. He even invaded India, sacking Delhi. Basically everything within 1,000 miles of Samarkand was wiped out. He also became a great patron of the arts, turning Samarkand into one of the world's great cities. He died on his way to an attempted conquest of China. Number 8. The Islamic slave trade at 18.5 million. The Muslims operated their own slave trade for over 1,000 years that was the largest in history. Islam was the only major civilization to keep practicing slavery into the Axial Age period. There were a couple reasons for this, and different Islamic slave trades on top of each other. One was for cheap slaves to work in the sugarcane fields or as house slaves, who were largely imported from sub-Saharan Africa. This was a brutal trade, with the slaves being walked over the Sahara, where the vast majority would die. Some African slaves also became court eunuchs and officials. The reason that the Middle East doesn't have large African populations in the same way the Americas does is that the Muslims practiced mass castration of their African slaves. Then another slave trade was caused by this strange Muslim practice of Mamelukes. Since Muslim society was so tribal, the ruler couldn't trust giving power to another tribe. Thus he would hire slaves to be in his army. These came largely from Central Asian Turks, Caucasians, and later Albanians. The irony is that since they had the weapons, they often became quite wealthy and installed themselves as rulers. The medieval Middle East was often governed by these slave states. In Mameluke Egypt, you couldn't pass your official title onto your children, so a new generation of slaves had to be imported from the Caucasus to hold power for each generation. The ruler's concubines were also often slaves, normally from Eastern Europe or the Caucasus. This meant that the ruling dynasties in the Muslim world were often majority Slavic ancestry. This meant that the Muslim world was dependent upon slavery for multiple levels, ranging from the highest to the lowest social classes. The Muslims practiced the slave trade until European colonization made it unsavory. The Europeans banned slavery, which in real life was practiced deep into the 20th century, and IRL is still practiced today. I mean, hell, the guest workers in the Gulf states aren't that far from being slaves today. 7. Stalin at 20 million. You guys all know this one. Stalin pulled himself to the top of the bloody Soviet politics only to cause more blood. Stalin was deeply paranoid that someone else would take his power in the manner he did, and what about killing every element of the society that could potentially provide leadership alternate to him? He butchered the officers, doctors, religious officials, artists, and more. No one trusted anyone in Stalin's Russia. The state infested every aspect of life. Almost no one survived the purges of Stalin's leadership, even his most devoted sycophants. His butchering of the yeoman peasant class, especially in Ukraine, caused a mass famine that killed millions. Stalin committed genocide against countless ethnic minorities, including the Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Volga Germans, Chechens, and was planning one against the Jews. Stalin, by his deathbed, had bled Russian society white, and there is even a rumor that he was killed by his doctor after he realized that he was on his next list for the next purge. Number 6. The Taiping Rebellion, also at 20 million deaths. It's funny how no one's heard of the fourth bloodiest war in history. China was an overpopulated and dysfunctional society facing a secular cycle. It was run by a Manchu ruling elite that viewed the native population with contempt. A young man, Hong Shuquan, who had failed the test to enter the imperial bureaucracy, started having delirious fantasies that he was the second coming of Christ. He then formed a new religion that was vaguely Christian, which supported communism, free love, and him being the new messiah. He raised an army of millions, marching from Guangdong to seize Nanjing as the capital. His army then tried to take Beijing, the imperial capital, before being wiped out by Mongol cavalry serving the empire in the winter snow. The next decade was a bloodbath as the empire gradually surrounded and strangled the Taipings. The empire used Western mercenaries and grassroots organizations to gradually whittle down the Taipings as their messiah started to go completely crazy. Number 5. The Manchu conquest of China at 25 million deaths. The Ming Dynasty, remember the one that formed earlier in this video, had grown decadent after 200 years. It had lost any ability to function and was mired in silly internal squabbles inside the court. A bandit warlord named the Dashing Prince was able to gain mass support in northern China. Bandits in general became such a big problem as to stop China functioning. The central government was incapable of stopping the Dashing Prince, and he declared himself emperor. The centralized monarchy wasn't able to deal with these threats, and he went mad. The emperor then started killing his own family, only to kill himself. The Manchu barbarians then invaded northern China, only to have the imperial army sent to defeat them choose to side with them instead. The Manchus then gradually ground down China. The native Chinese weren't unified and split into different warlords who the Manchus beat. The Manchus could have won the war much more easily but demanded the native Chinese, who, need I remind you, made up 97% of the population of their new empire, wore this humiliating top-knot hairstyle to show their submission. This made the divided Chinese fight extra hard for freedom, in which they were still unsuccessful. The Manchus made the Chinese wear this top knot for the next 300 years. The Chinese had this pirate warlord who operated off the coast of Fujian in Taiwan give the Manchus a run for their money before being crushed. The Dutch also had a colony on Taiwan that the Manchus conquered. Ironically, this was the reason China conquered Taiwan in the first place, and you could technically say the Dutch have an earlier right to the island than the Chinese. Number 4. The famines in British India with 27 million deaths. It's funny that this is the only entry for India, given until recently they have been consistently a quarter of the human race. This one is different from all the others. If you drew up this list in a certain way, it wouldn't be here, but I respect Matthew White's choice, so I'm keeping it here. India was overpopulated and its agriculture primitive, and thus that set it up for a large famine. There were 5 big famines in British India which killed millions of people each, stretching from the mid-18th to 20th centuries. In Indian culture beforehand, there was an expectation the government should feed people in starving times. Democratic India afterwards didn't have any famines, given any government that let its people starve wouldn't be re-elected. The British, however, thought the government feeding the people during famine would promote indolence and laziness, that any government intervention in the economy was bad. A famine would start, the British would refuse to feed anyone, and then tens of millions of people would die. The British also didn't stop price gouging either, thinking the hand of the market was always good. It's pretty comparable to the famine in Ireland, which caused my family to immigrate to America, which lessened the island's population by 2/3. Number 3. Mao Zedong at 40 million deaths. We met Mao earlier in this video. Upon installing himself as dictator of China, he then went out trying to push for the Great Leap Forward. This was an attempt to push China from an agrarian pre-industrial society to a modern one in 5 years. This completely failed, since of course it did. He tried to institute Marxist-style agriculture, which didn't work, and then caused mass famine. 35 million people died in this famine, making it the worst one in all of history. The final 5 million came from his purges of the educated classes. In the Cultural Revolution, Mao's wife pushed for purging intellectual types. Teachers, academics, and more were all killed. This was an attempt to completely remake society by destroying old knowledge. Mao was deeply paranoid and completely mad by the end. He was personally a pretty horrible person, driving almost all of his relatives mad, as well as letting multiple of his children starve. He also partially started the Korean War as a way of killing off the previous nationalist military. He actively wanted a nuclear war since it would bring the world closer to true communism, and some Chinese would survive, while less of the industrialized nations would. Number 2. Genghis Khan, also at 40 million deaths. Genghis Khan was the son of a Mongol chief who died in war. He had to survive alone on the steppe with his family. He then rose through his own talents to lead a tribe and then be the first leader to unify the Mongols. He was an organizational genius who constructed a new structure for Mongol society and military command single-handedly. He then launched an invasion of western China, bringing the Uyghurs into his coalition before invading the North Chinese plain. He destroyed a Chinese army at the Battle of the Badger's Mouth, where he sent a force to scale mountains to surround and slaughter the Chinese army, which had 4 times as many men as him. He then used Chinese engineers to build siege engines to take the capital of Beijing. He then slaughtered the entire population. Some of Genghis's men were killed by the Shah of Khorasan, a Muslim state in Central Asia who picked a fight to further his glory. This has got to be one of the worst mistakes in history, and Genghis pulled their army 4 times, again his size, deep into the desert where they started to die of thirst before he slaughtered them. The son of the Khorasani king fled to India where he raised another army, which Genghis again crushed on the banks of the river Indus. As the Mongolians conquered the entire steppe, crushing the Russian states at the Battle of Khalkha River, as well as invading northern Iran, destroying the centuries-old respected assassins of Alamut. Some people might not believe these numbers. How was it possible to kill 40 million people in the Middle Ages? The short answer is partly ruthlessness. The Mongols viewed farmers as sheep who should be culled when necessary, in the same way you kill a sheep herd when it's not going to make through the winter. The Mongols originally wanted to completely depopulate northern China and turn it into a grassland, so Genghis Khan killed something like 2/3 of northern China's population before realizing it was more profitable to keep the Chinese as workers. Also, the Mongols would wreck irrigation canals in regions of the world that really needed them. The Mongols destroyed the irrigation canals in Central Asia, for example, permanently turning the region from one of the wealthiest in the world to a backwater. And number 1 is World War II at 66 million deaths. No surprises there. Part of me just wants to skip this segment, given I know all of you already know every part of it. Germany felt humiliated by World War I and thus picked Hitler, who turned the genocide of Eastern Europe into his dominant political platform. The Germans invaded Poland thinking the British and French would appease them, as they did many times before. This didn't happen, which caused a war between them. The Germans then wiped out Poland and France and much of the rest of continental Europe out while the British held on. The Germans then launched an invasion of the Soviet Union, which was their target the whole time. This is where most or half of the deaths in the war took place. The Soviets and Nazis both viewed human life with contempt and so killed indiscriminately. Both fed their own men into the meat grinder, which consumed millions of lives in single battles. The Russians were able to barely turn the Germans back from their industrial heartland and push the Germans back west for the rest of the war until they reached Germany itself. The Germans at this point also started the Holocaust, or mass killings of groups they didn't like, such as the Jews, Gypsies, Poles, homosexuals, and more. This totaled around 10 million deaths. The Japanese were also pushing for their own empire at the same time in the Orient. Boxed in by oil sanctions by the Americans due to their invasion of French Vietnam, the Japanese attacked an American naval base in Hawaii, which pulled America into the war. The Japanese, however, briefly had a massive colonial empire stretching from Alaska to New Guinea. The Japanese killed 20 million people in their eastern theater of the war, almost all of whom were in China, while 40 million died in the European theater. America's entry into the war basically ended it for the Axis. America's sheer power in demographics, economy, technology, and more meant that they were able to wipe out the Japanese and launch an invasion of Western Europe, where they split the subcontinent with the Russians. The Americans invented the atomic bomb, which they then dropped on Japan, finally ending the war. You could probably make a full video on outtakes for this list, which a wiser man than me would be able to construct a lot more from, but here are a few ones I came to. I guess the underlying trend behind all of this is humility. What this list showed me is how Eurocentric our histories are. I understand Europe accomplished most of the greatest things in the modern world, but at the same time, most human lives and most great events in history occurred in completely different civilizations that we never think about from a Western context. Tamerlane can legitimately call himself one of the greatest conquerors in history, but very few people have heard of him. Anlou Shan fought a war on the scale of World War I 1,500 years ago in an empire most people in our society have never heard of. What you see is that these other societies do things and are dragged into conflicts that have nothing to do with us. Again, the Europeans aren't perfect, and you see from this list lots of really horrible events that occur from European colonialism. But you also see their match from other areas of the world. Another conclusion is that with 3 exceptions, all of the events in this list occurred in Eurasia. That since until 100 years ago, Eurasia held 90% of the human race's population. In many ways, the history of the world was the history of Eurasia until pretty recently. It really does change your view on history as who makes it to the top of the list here. One conclusion is that Chinese really like killing each other. I think that's due to the strength of the state in Chinese history, meaning that they really muster very large armies. India scores very low on this list for the opposite reason, that the state is very weak there, with the priests running in what in many ways is a pacifist society. Of the top-ranked ones, a very disproportionate amount are Mongol conquests or communism. This was a hard pill to swallow since I've always loved the Mongols. Mongol metal is one of my favorite types of music. There's a big community of historians who love to fanboy the Mongols, and that was the dominant philosophic view among the 2010s for medieval historians. However, when you realize that some form of Manchu or Mongol conquest killed close to 100 million people, when the world's population was something like 600 million, it makes you question that whole story of history. People often ask me why I'm so harsh on communism. The reason is actually from reading this book and realizing how communism killed more people than every other ideology in history combined. The death communist leaders inflicted upon their own people isn't comparable to anything else in history. I don't understand how Nazism killed a quarter of the people that communism did, and it's taboo, but communism is still a politically acceptable alternative. I believe another important outtake is how recent a lot of these wars are. World War II, Stalin, Mao, British India, and more are all still in living memory. In that, I could interview people who live through them now. Isn't that insane? It should also be humbling for people who think that we're beyond crises like this now. As I look at the years ahead, which I have predicted will be ugly, let's keep in mind how really brutal our human nature can be. What I'll also throw in is how low these death tolls are. That makes me sound like a sociopath, but let's keep in mind how the world has 4 times the population today as it did during World War II, and 8 times that of what it had 200 years ago. The thing is that China losing 25 million people in the 1600s is a quarter of their population. Germany lost a third of its population in the 30 Years' War. The thing is that those kinds of death tolls are completely reasonable today, especially with how interconnected our supply chains are. Let's just say, I really don't want to have to redo this list and add some new additions over the next 10 years, but I know in my heart that I'm going to have to. Sleep tight tonight, gang.